in the spirit of transparency, this is a restart. I just wanted to put that on the table. Steve Murphy.
For technical reasons.
For technical reasons.
Yeah.
Steve Murphy is here. It's to celebrate his third book, Murphy's Logic, not Murphy's Law, as I erroneously referred to it earlier. Maybe that'll show up in the socials. Congratulations on the career.
Thank you, Sheldon.
For being a part of people's lives for so long. I'm wondering, as you now approach 2 years since that last newscast, how life for Steve Murphy has gone.
Life is busy and life is very rewarding. And I'll be honest with you, Sheldon, when I made the decision to stop doing daily newscasting, I at the same time decided I didn't want to retire. I wanted to, I've used this phrase before to the point of making it a cliche, to rewire my life. Right. And that mainly involved changing the routine of not getting up quite so early in the morning and concentrating on the daily news agenda and then working from 9 until 7 and then into the evening doing the preparation for the next day, something with which you're familiar given your long career as well. So I wanted to rewire that part of my life, and doing a book, or at least doing a retrospective, was part of the plan. Maybe not exactly the book that I ended up doing for reasons that I discuss in the book, but that was part of the plan. And of course, CTV made it possible for me to continue to keep my finger in the water, if you will, or my toe in the water by doing the biweekly commentary pieces, which incidentally are greatly liberating as well, in that instead of reporting the news and concentrating only on accuracy and facts and balance and fairness, now there can be an opportunity to express opinions, hopefully fair and well-researched opinions, but it is real freedom when you're allowed to comment on the issues of the day as opposed to just report them.
Will there be a Murphy's Logic piece on the changes announced to Live at 5?
Well, I'm just digesting those changes as well, and I'm not entirely sure what is going to be involved in those changes. So I don't know. It's too early to say. I am a fan of the notion of doing early evening national news, and I have been for quite some time. I'm quite surprised at the time that the network is chosen. But that said, national programming decisions are often made taking into account issues that we don't consider locally. So like most of your viewers, I suspect I'm really just trying to digest that information and figure out exactly what I think of it.
How has life changed, your day-to-day? What is different now than 2 years ago?
Well, the main difference is that I make time for myself. For one thing, and it's often the first thing, I get up and spend 45 minutes or an hour on the treadmill digesting the morning news, as opposed to, having the radio on in the shower and having television on and reading newspapers or being online. So, I'm really taking some time for myself, something I wasn't really able to do in the schedule I had before. That's one big change. The other change is just not having the constancy of the deadlines. As you know from your career in radio, the news doesn't wait. It comes on at a certain time, it ends at a certain time, and the production values demand that deadlines be met constantly. That becomes a real pressure point, I think, after a certain number of years. It certainly did for me. So the deadlines now are much more flexible because, frankly, I make them all. And if I wish to push my deadline, with few exceptions, I'm able to do so.
Speaking with a few people in the office today, and your book is on their list for the upcoming. They want a copy, and they want to,
good to
hear what it is that you have to say. You write and talk about this is not just your story and your career, but also about defining what is news. And I don't think that there has ever been a time where it's more important for that. What is news, Steve Murphy?
Well, again, it's hard to distill into a few paragraphs of speech what it took me, chapters to write. But generally speaking, a news program or a newspaper, what we used to call a newspaper or a news website, is a collection of the important, the interesting, what I call the exceptional and the accessible. And all of those factors determine what gets into the news in whichever form or fashion you choose to receive it. The important is fairly interesting to understand. Developments in society that affect almost everyone are important because they affect almost everyone. Then there are the things that are just plain interesting, and some of the things that are important are also hopefully interesting or presented in an interesting way. But there's also room for things in the news that are just commentary on the society or the world we live in that spark our interest. That brings me to the practical question of what is accessible. Some stories may be very, very good, may be very important, may be very interesting, but might not be accessible because we can't find people to speak about them or because we haven't got resources to tell them. And the fourth and final factor or characteristic of news is exceptional information. When you live in a society as we do, where for whatever our problems, things generally work pretty well, It's the dysfunction that tends to become newsworthy. So when things go well, it isn't news. It's when they don't go well. When we have a housing crisis, when we have tents in the Grand Parade, that's when we cover those as stories. So they are the characteristics or qualities of news. Having said that, there are pages and pages and pages, I think, in the book that really expand upon that idea and particularly deal with what is news versus a lot of the information that is masquerading as news, particularly in social platforms.
And that's very interesting you mentioned that, because it happens to be on my list, which is a good thing. That you wrote this book after finding some old editorials, some old opinion pieces that you wrote, and
Right.
how your position has changed through time and it has evolved. How has the news industry evolved in your experience?
Well, again, that's a great question. It is still evolving. The main way in which news has evolved is in delivery, because the definition of news hasn't changed. News is by nature not fake. News needs to be fair, accurate, and balanced, and told by people who have taken their opinions, whatever they might be, and set them aside, presumably running everything they can through a filter of fairness and objectivity. And by the way, I don't particularly like the term objectivity, because it's hard to be objective, but it is not hard to be fair. So the definition of news hasn't changed, but the way that information is being processed and delivered is much different. When I started working in a radio newsroom using old, Olivetti Underwood typewriters and with a teletype machine that spit out sort of one character per second, news was pretty clear to recognize because there weren't a lot of people dabbling in it. There was the paper that showed up on your doorstep in the evening. There might have been a television newscast. There was the radio in the morning. But we didn't have people going to their own personal devices, able to select from literally hundreds of millions of sites, proffering information, some of which looks like news. But news is not just information. News is properly curated, it is responsibly reported and edited, and it is information presented by people who are willing and able and required to be responsible for its authorship. So that has changed. Today, the information you get is determined mainly by you. But what filters you use for filtering the information, I can't be held responsible for those. You need to be. But people really need to spend more time asking, I think, whether they're using adequate filters.
Where do your children get their news? How do they find information out in the world?
You know, my kids, I think, are probably pretty typical of people of their generation. My daughter's 35 years old. My son is 25 years old. I think they spend a lot of time in social media. I also think, given the nature of their dad's work, and in the case of both my children, their mother's work, that they may be a little more aware of traditional media sources, and perhaps they consume a little bit more social media. I do think that both of my children are pretty competent consumers of information, because I think they are perhaps a little skeptical about information. And frankly, I think a little bit of skepticism, or at least a little bit of caution about where the information is coming from, is a good thing.
And your thoughts on misinformation, disinformation, and that whole accountability issue?
Sure. Well, look, the words sound the same, but they're profoundly different. Misinformation is when information is reported inaccurately by mistake. We do make mistakes. Good journalism written by people who are willing to be responsible for it includes corrections. When errors get made, we correct them. Disinformation is the deliberate and malicious attempt to mislead people. And it's very, very hard sometimes to tell the difference, because in addition to being very malevolent, these people are also very clever. Many of them are not even people. You know, we're seeing the role of artificial intelligence in these things is growing. But the disinformation and misinformation frequently looks just as good as the information. In fact, in some cases, it looks even better. Again, another reason why, as consumers, we need to ask who wrote it, and when was it written, and where was it written, why was it written, how was it written. That's the 5 W's and the H that the consumer of news now needs to use, just as we do in journalism.
Are politicians more or less accountable than they used to be?
They're less accountable.
How so?
Well, they're less accountable because, and I'll give you one very good example of this. When I moved to Nova Scotia in 1980, was told that I had to call the Premier of Nova Scotia. You could look up John Buchanan's phone number in the telephone directory and call his home. and you could often get the Premier on the telephone. Now, he may have had a private line for the people he wanted to talk to, as I say in the book, but he did have a published number. Mrs. Buchanan often answered the phone. The Premier often came on the phone. It was possible in that time, Sheldon, to reach people in positions of authority directly. Today, the people, I think, who are elected to higher office are unaccountable because there are so many people around them providing the bubble wrap that they think is necessary to protect those people from us. I don't mean journalists, I mean the public. I don't think that leaders need to be protected, except physically, of course. We don't want to endanger them. But good leaders don't need to be protected from public opinion and good, accountable journalism. But they are bubble wrapped by a lot of people who do. So no, I think there's less accountability, and I think the public's fed up with it.
I saw a pattern of behavior that continued after the pandemic where there were suspension of media scrums for obvious reasons, for health reasons.
Yes.
And this one question, one follow-up.
Right.
That's continued. That's now in some ways.
Well, we have to stop it. We people who are still practicing journalism daily need to stand up and say enough of this.
When it comes to reading statements provided, I know
Against
there's been pushback, severe pushback, because it does not answer the question.
That's right. Well, journalism, I think, reporters, perhaps out of necessity and driven by deadlines, sometimes give into this notion that we'll ask Minister Sheldon MacLeod a question, and Minister MacLeod's assistants will say, well, he's not available, but we'll give you a statement. The journalist then feels obliged to answer the statement. But here's the problem with that. That allows the speaker, in this case Minister MacLeod, to have a platform that goes virtually unchallenged and unfiltered. That may be providing the notion of balance in a story, but there's no accountability attached to it. So yes, there is some need to use statements, but I think we really need to spend more time telling our readers, listeners, and viewers that the minister did not agree to answer any questions and instead said only this, and then add the qualification, and we can't ask him any questions about that either. So no, to me, that's not really accountability. That's evading an answer. That isn't really an answer.
And in Murphy's Logic, you do point out a particular example where I believe it was Aaron O'Toole, the Conservative leader, to whom you said, "You've answered a question I did not ask."
Yeah, well, this gets back to talking points. Something that I think we all know that politicians and business leaders use talking points, which is to say, irrespective of what the question is, here's the message you want to get out. I think the public sees through that. I think the public is increasingly quite distressed, if not disgusted by it. But journalists ought to be disgusted by it. Because if you ask me what time it is and I tell you it's Tuesday, I haven't answered your question. I've provided a response to a question. That's not an answer. So sure, I tried, and I guess I got a little more surly about this as the years went on, but I did get to the point, particularly with political leaders, where I'd say, but that isn't what I asked you. And a response is not an answer. And, in the case of Mr. O'Toole, who incidentally was quite good at answering questions, during an election campaign, someone told him, here's your message. This is the message you need to deliver. So yes, he gave me an answer to a question I did not ask.
Who did you prefer to interview? Politicians, celebrities, normal people who were thrust into whatever extraordinary circumstance?
Well, I mean, I did a lot of political interviews when I was doing a daily current affairs interview, because so much of our life, is determined by policymakers. I enjoyed interviewing politicians, and frankly, I like most politicians. But I enjoyed doing some celebrity interviews. I didn't do that many as my career went on. I enjoyed interviewing business people. But yes, I had many very satisfying interviews with people who were being interviewed because of something they had done that was extraordinary. People who had displayed great valor during the Second World War, Holocaust survivors who lived to tell their story and told it with great dignity and with real lived experience. And people who, well, I talk about the Lucky Lillingtons, the people who won the 649, not once, but twice, with a ticket bought in the same store. I mean, to me, those kind of interviews provided an entirely different view of life, but part of the definition of what is news. They were interesting, they were exceptional, they were interesting. Was it important that they won the lottery? Was to them, but it sure was interesting.
There's so much about your career and the time that you spend in the news industry that I think is important, and I wanted to talk for just a second about Donald Marshall Jr. and the admission you made that you perhaps got it wrong.
Oh, I did get it wrong.
First time around with his conviction
Yeah.
and saying he owned some responsibility for his circumstances.
Yeah, well, I said he was the architect of his own misfortune. But I was wrong. He wasn't the architect of his own misfortune. He may have been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But Donald Marshall Jr. was convicted of a crime he did not commit and incarcerated because of the system that existed at the time. And I was part of that system. And it's easy to sit, I guess, here all these years later and condemn a system. Let me be a little bit more clear. I grew up with an appreciation of the justice system, an appreciation of policing, and a sense that government was somehow fair, and particularly the justice system was fair. Wrong. Wrong on most of those counts. Yes, policing is important, but the media are not arms of the police, and the police, as I indicate in the book, bend the rules whenever it suits them. If they believe that it's in the interest of law enforcement, they will bend, if not break the rules. The justice system makes mistakes, but the justice system was also being run by people who we now describe, I guess, generally as privileged, but that was certainly the case 40 years ago, 50 years ago when I was a child. We believed, I think, that the system would deliver a fair verdict, but the system had been put in a position where everything coming out of it had to be unfair because so much of what was going in was unfair. So, yeah, when I said Donald Marshall was the master of his own misfortune, I was wrong. And when I said that he was entitled to only limited compensation, I was wrong. And I needed a lot of time, I guess, to say that because I was out of the commentary business. But I feel very badly about that. I got to know Junior Marshall afterward. He was a man of very great importance historically and a man of extraordinary quiet dignity and strength. And yeah, I was wrong.
The court of public opinion is one in which very few people have any influence or control over. And had you an opportunity ever to speak with Buffy St. Marie?
I don't believe I've even ever met Buffy St. Marie, although she could have come through a studio. I've never interviewed Buffy St. Marie. I'm quite certain of that.
Curious as to your thoughts. It was journalism that brought this story to the public's attention. It was the public that brought it to the journalists to suggest that this woman was not who she said she was.
Right.
What do you feel about cancel culture in her situation?
Well, let me address the notion of cancel culture first. I make a reference in the book to preferring context to cancellation, and I still do. I know there were many things done and many crimes perpetrated for which we are now very sorry as a society and for which we should make not only apology but proper amends. But I think it's important that those things be explained in the context of their time, because otherwise they may be forgotten. And I don't think forgetting these things is a good idea. Cancellation to me equals forgetting, and the last thing we need to do is forget our past. We had a dramatic example of this just recently when apparently every member of the House of Commons forgot that Canada was on the side of Russia in the Second World War. That is shocking and unacceptable. At the time of year when we're practicing remembrance and the ritual and the rites of remembrance, our members of Parliament and our government should be asking, how could we have forgotten that? How could we be applauding someone who was battling our enemy in the Second War? So to me, canceling is not helping. It is encouraging forgetting, and forgetting mistakes is not a good idea, in my opinion, and in my experience. In the specific case of Buffy St. Marie, I did watch the piece in question. There was exhaustive research done. I've subsequently heard that there may be some issue about the issuance of birth certificates in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and that adopted people may indeed have been issued birth certificates as though they had been born of their adoptive parents in Massachusetts. I do not know if that's true. Right. I have read that. I read it from credible sources, but I'm uncertain as to whether it's true, so please don't take my word for it. But I will say this. It's a serious matter, and when we begin as a society to take a look at all of our heroes and role models, we are going to find fault with many, with most, maybe with all, because so far as I know, none of us is perfect. Some of us have more to apologize for, some of us have more perhaps to even cover up than others, but everybody's got something.
Did you learn anything about yourself writing this book?
Yes, I did. The first is that as a young person, and in this respect, I'm not unique. As young people, we have very, very firm opinions about things, born of our youth and inexperience and our temerity, and that those youthful opinions and those beliefs were probably quite sincere, but we grow out of them. Oh, it's a good thing. So I learned that many of the things that I said and did, you know, in my life and in my career, you know, I'd like to take those back. But of course, one can't do that. And look, Sheldon, that is an experience that we all have in one form or another. As we all get older and our hair falls out or goes gray, and as we get the wrinkles and the bags and the pot bellies and the whole thing, we all realize how wrong we were. But again, in the context of our life, you know, we need to examine, you know, why we did those things and realize why now we know better. So yeah, no, I learned that, and I guess I learned it in a very personal way because so many of the things I said back then I wrote down. You know, so I don't have any recordings of them, which is probably a good thing, but I did have literally hundreds and hundreds of pages of things I said. And so yeah, there were a lot of lessons learned. One other thing I learned is that when you're young, you're not always wrong. And if you say enough, you're bound to get a few things right. So.
Had you ever considered politics? I'm curious, what would Steve Murphy have done had it not been for news?
No, I did consider politics, and politics, if I might say so, considered me. I had offers from really all of the major political parties to run federally and provincially, and I guess I maybe toyed with the idea early in my life. But as I spent more time interviewing policymakers and particularly political leaders, I really came to relish the role of the inquisitor and not so much the prosecutor, not the opponent, so much as a person who had an accountability role that I think is an important part of the democratic system. But one need not be in a legislature or at City Hall or in the House of Commons to do that. You get to do it in your work. I got to do it in mine. And I think, you know, journalism, public affairs has an important and an enduring role to play in that. But no, I have great affection for politicians generally, though, because most of the people that I've met in my career who are in politics got in for the right reasons and really tried to accomplish something. They're often accused as a group of being in it for themselves. Good politicians don't get in it for themselves because most of them end up with very little for themselves in terms of lost time. Yes, they make above average wages, but they also pay quite a high price for the work they do in terms of the number of hours and the number of events and the number of lost weekends and so on. So I'm not going to sit here and defend politicians as a group, except to say that I don't dislike them.
If you had not gotten that opportunity as a young man, 17 years old, still in high school, to work at a radio station and then to keep in the business for as many years as you had, do you have any thoughts of where you might have ended up?
Oh, sure. Well, I was going to go to journalism school. That was part of the plan. And I always toyed with the idea of maybe at some point going to law school. And then I got a little bit, I guess I was disappointed in the law the closer I got to it. Again, lawyers play an important role in our society, and law and order is important. But I guess the closer I got to it, the more I realized that I think I'd rather be on the outside of that looking in as well. So yes, I had those youthful ideas, but I guess as the years went on, they sort of wore off and left me where I am today.
Relatively young man in retirement and still working. So I wanted to point that out. So
sure, thanks.
I don't know who first coined the phrase "these quick snappers," but
I think it came from Reach for the Top.
Did it?
Do you remember that TV show on CBC
absolutely.
television?
Yeah.
I remember we had it in New Brunswick growing up, but the short snappers here in Nova Scotia were by Jerry Fogarty.
Okay.
On the legendary Jerry Fogarty and Les Studley on Reach for the Top.
Les Studley, I actually worked with Les for a time.
Good man.
So short snapper time.
Sure.
Your impressions of these people. W. Douglas Murphy, Frances Lillian, Teresa Murphy.
My parents, great people, ethical, moral, decent, hardworking. Miss them. My dad's been dead almost exactly 10 years. My mother almost 20. Good, very, very good people. Learned all the important lessons in life from them.
Justin Trudeau.
Gifted as a communicator. Very, very high emotional intelligence. I think brighter than he's given credit for. Should not be underestimated. Never seen anyone work a room any better, more ably than Justin Trudeau. And for the 30 seconds that you are in his life, you are the laser focus of his attention. He's extraordinary.
Pierre Poilievre.
Should not be underestimated. Very, very bright man, very articulate, and has a very, very keen sense of where the country is on a lot of issues. And I'm going to just add this. I think the battle between Trudeau and Poilievre, if there is one, will be one for the ages.
Donald Trump.
Donald Trump, showman, in the tradition of P.T. Barnum, maybe with some of the same proclivities. I think that Trump is also not to be underestimated, but Trump is really in it mostly for Trump. And if you've read any of his work or listened to him extensively, you will know that because he makes it pretty clear.
John McCain.
A man of great integrity and courage, physical courage, intellectual courage. I think a very sincere man. And I think that the right man for president, but at the wrong time.
Jack Layton.
Another extraordinary communicator, a very decent and funny man, and a man who probably could have led the NDP as Prime Minister of Canada.
Elton John.
Soundtrack of my life. Yeah, the one that got away.
Yeah.
No, I would have loved to have interviewed him as one of the celebrity interviews of my career. I think he's been obviously a great contributor to our social culture, but I also think he's been a leader in so many things. And I think back to the early days when he was, not single-handedly, but he was certainly leading the global fight against AIDS. He was way ahead of his time. He was courageous. I also think that he's just probably the greatest composer of popular music of the age.
And Stephen Murphy.
Very happy guy. People say, how's he doing? I say he's never been better. And I think that's generally true. Maybe seldom been better is a good answer. But no, very, very, very happy and very, very grateful. I think gratitude's an important thing. And finally, I think I'm well. And I'm going to say that because you know that wellness is an important thing to me, both as a concept and as a sign-off. So yeah, no, I'm feeling well.
Be well. And thank you so much for doing this. I truly appreciate your time. The book is fantastic.
Well, thanks, Sheldon.
Nimbus is the publisher, and I'm sure it's on people's list.
I want to give Nimbus a shout out too. You know, Nimbus is a Canadian business. Yeah. It's a maritime business, Halifax-based business. It is female-led, and they're extraordinary people. And I'm not just saying that because they published my book, but no, they are. Top drawer, very proud of them.
Well, I wish you well in the safe walk home in the snow.
Thank you.
Steve Murphy, thank you.
Thanks, you guys.